Thank you for joining us. Here's a look at some of the top stories that we're watching right now. The Senate is working on gun control legislation. Texas Republican John Cornyn says that he's optimistic that at least 10 Republicans will vote with Democrats to advance a bill that will be able to withstand a challenge from other Republicans. Plus, gas prices reach another record high today, and there's little hope for relief heading into the peak summer driving months. While many analysts say that low supply is driving the surge, there are now concerns about low refining capacity. And concerns over rising crime could be what turns part of deep blue California red as voters head to the polls in primaries today. Our Ed O'Keefe is in Los Angeles. Plus, a new Department of Homeland Security warning is out in the aftermath of the mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas. What you need to be aware of and why you may need to be careful when being online. And later this hour, as food prices around the globe rise, Russia's military assault on Ukraine is about to drive them even higher. Our Chris Livesay is in Odessa, covering the war's impact on the global food supply. But amid gun control talks currently dominating much of the conversation on Capitol Hill, inflation and the economy continue to resonate. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen admitted last week that she was wrong about the path of inflation. Today, she testified in front of the Senate Finance Committee.
I think that bringing inflation down should be our #1 priority, and President Biden, in an op-ed on inflation in recent remarks, has indicated that it is our top priority.
Meanwhile, gas prices on average rose another 5 cents Tuesday to reach a new record high level of $4.92 a gallon. These levels are 62 cents per gallon more than a month ago. And we keep inching closer to being $2 more per gallon than a year ago. But as CBS News' Skylar Henry reports from Capitol Hill, however, it's gun violence that's still at the forefront.
Congressional Democrats gathered with gun violence victims, including former colleague Gabby Giffords on the National Mall, where more than 45,000 flowers represent lives lost in the past year.
We must never stop fighting. Fight, fight, fight.
What I loved most about her was the way she loved her family unconditionally.
At the same time, former Buffalo Fire Commissioner Garnell Whitfield Jr. gave emotional testimony about his mother at a Senate hearing on domestic terrorism. Ruth Whitfield was one of 10 victims gunned down in the racist massacre at a top supermarket.
I ask every one of you to imagine the faces of your mothers as you look at mine, and ask yourself, is there nothing that we can do?
That's a question federal lawmakers are trying to answer when it comes to gun control. This week, the House is moving forward on a wide-ranging package, but it's not likely to pass in the evenly divided Senate. Separately, a bipartisan group of senators is trying to find a narrow compromise that could include enhanced background checks, incentives for states to pass red flag laws, and investments in schools and mental health.
Step one is to try to get a deal. As I've said repeatedly, I hope that'll be sooner rather than later.
Lead negotiator, Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy went to the White House to update President Biden.
My goal is to try to get an agreement this week.
Actor Matthew McConaughey also came to the White House a day after discussing gun reform with lawmakers.
We are in a window of opportunity right now that we have not been in before. A window where it seems like real change can happen.
He grew up in Uvalde, Texas, where the Robb Elementary School mass shooting took the lives of 19 children and 2 teachers. Skylar Henry, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
Former Congressman Will Hurd joins us now. He represented Texas's 23rd Congressional District, where, of course, Uvalde, Texas is located, from 2015 to 2021. Congressman, thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you, and we appreciate your time. As I mentioned, you represented a district that included Uvalde, Texas. It seems like the more we learn about the response to this mass shooting at Robb Elementary School, the more damning it seems. Here's an area that had an armed force specifically designated to protect schools. But beyond that, what else could we be doing to protect schools, to protect children, in your view?
Well, that's why understanding what actually happened that day that the Uvalde killer massacred all those children is important, not only for closure for those families in that community. You have to remember, Uvalde is a small town. Everybody knows everybody. So it's not just family members that are grieving, it's the entire community. And those moms and those dads that have had to bury their children prematurely deserve to have answers on what happened. And then we also need to figure out how those same mistakes weren't made. We haven't gotten a full reporting of what happened. It seems to appear that a lot of mistakes were made. And I hope that mayors and county judges and sheriffs and chiefs of police for cities, for schools, are reviewing their tactics, techniques, and procedures on how to deal with these kinds of things so that we don't see the kind of problems that appear to have happened in Uvalde.
And meanwhile, there are a lot of people wondering what Congress can and should be doing. In your op-ed in the New York Times on Monday titled, "I'm a Republican who represents Uvalde, Texas. I want more than thoughts and prayers." Congressman, unfortunately, you've been through this many times, having served in Congress. We have a mass shooting. We see a majority of Americans support some type of gun reform or gun control or some kind of restriction. And then Congress fails to enact anything or fails to act on anything. In your view, because you've been there, take us kind of behind the scenes a little bit. I mean, what really gets in the way? And then specifically for your party, I mean, what are the pressure points these days for Republicans when it comes to this?
Well, the pressure is the concern that people are going to be seen as anti-Second Amendment. Calling for a universal background check is not anti-Second Amendment. The fact that every responsible gun owner I know have gone through a background check. It's plain and simple. Calling for an increase in age to buy a semi-automatic weapon. You already have to be 21 years old to buy a handgun. And let's say if you want an 18 or a 19 or a 20-year-old to be able to purchase a semi-automatic rifle, maybe they go through the same background checks and training that you have to do in order to go hunting. This is not restricting anybody's constitutional rights. This doesn't prevent a family from going out and shooting birds or going hunting. These are the rhetoric needs to go away, but it's also, I challenge my colleagues to think about what would you say to that mother and that father that just buried their son or their daughter, right? And say, did you do everything to try to prevent this from happening in the future? What's been mind-boggling to me is the number of emails and texts and calls I've gotten from friends. They're talking about the conversations that they're having to have with their kids right now about what to do if a school shooting happens at their school. The fact that 50% of our kids are afraid of a school shooting happening at their school, that's insane that we're going to allow that to happen. And so, but we also got to make sure that what Senator Murphy and Senator Cornyn are working on, that look, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. It's not going to solve all the problems in the future. It's not going to have solved the problems of the past, but that momentum of getting something done is important. The far left and the far right is probably not going to like whatever they come up with, but we need to applaud them and thank them for whatever they do produce, because that can create momentum for other pieces of legislation, because we have to be doing, this is a multifactorial problem, and we need to be addressing different aspects of what happens when you see the metamorphosis of someone turn into a mass shooter.
And Congressman, when you say that lawmakers don't want to be seen as infringing upon any sort of Second Amendment right, I wonder, is it coming from the base? Is it coming from outside groups like the NRA? I mean, it's just really fascinating to me that you had former President Trump, a few years ago after Parkland, talk about taking people's guns away before due process was administered. I mean, he's been able to kind of say things on this. He's been supportive of red flag laws. The NRA seems to have kind of become a shell of what it used to be. But is it the Republican Party base at this point putting on that pressure on lawmakers, or is it coming from the lawmakers themselves?
Look, I think it's a narrow group of individuals, whether it's on social media, that are the loudest. That's usually what prevents many of these things from happening. I know y'all did a recent poll, and I know you've been focusing more on the 44% of Republicans that think that these shootings are a way of life. But I focus on the 56% that think that something ultimately needs to get done, and I think that's the change. I think the fact that we're seeing some of the teachers that were there, that we're hearing from some of the kids in Uvalde on what they went through, I think those testimonials are going to be impactful on potentially seeing more change happening. More people are still talking about this. Most schools are out. A lot of times these conversations and these events fade from the conversation in the news and on social media. This is continuing. And so I hope that Uvalde is an example to where we see some movement this week with what those senators are working on. And then that builds trust to say, hey, okay, we can get something done and we continue to do more. Because in my opinion, anybody who thinks that nothing can be done, then they need to go look for another job.
In your op-ed, you also say that we can't retreat to our political corners and repeat the same repeated talking points. I mean, it kind of seems like that's happening again. But now that you're out of Congress, has your perspective changed at all since you've left?
No, because look, it's evolved. I had an A rating in the NRA. They supported my reelections, but I also listened to groups like Moms Demand Action, and I was one of, I believe it was 8 Republicans who voted for HR 8, which was a piece of legislation extending growing background checks and having universal background checks. And so this was reasonable steps to make sure that we're protecting our kids and protecting people going to grocery stores and going to the hospital. These are not places that we should be afraid to go. And there's a lot we can do. There's a group called, it's a nonprofit organization called the Violence Project, and they've studied every mass shooting since 1966. We know the process of how somebody turns into a mass murderer. We have to address every step in that process. It's not just one thing. And then we also can't criticize those people that actually are going to do something. If there is this Senate bill that comes out and gets passed, people are going to say it's not enough. Well, movement matters. And that's going to build some momentum to try to do things in the future.
Certainly sending an important message. Congressman Will Hurd, thank you for your time. We appreciate it. And of course, we're thinking of your community. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
California is holding its midterm primaries today with 20 races happening across the state. The historically liberal city of Los Angeles is due for a new mayor, and 2 Democrats have come out as frontrunners. Progressive Representative Karen Bass is neck and neck with businessman Rick Caruso, who was a registered Republican until this year. His expected success is one of the 2 candidates to move on to the general election might signify a political shift in California. Tackling crime and homelessness are 2 issues important to voters in California this election season. Republicans in the 16 open primaries for House seats, are hoping their tougher stances on these issues will help shift the balance of power in the state and snatch up some more seats for the GOP. So CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe is in that state and joins us now for more. Hey there, Ed. I like those palm trees behind you and the purple shirt for Election Day on cue. We know you've been spending a lot of time talking to the 2 frontrunners in this mayor's race. I want to start with Karen Bass, who a lot of people know as a congresswoman here in Washington. So why and how is she planning to try and trade the halls of Congress for City Hall?
Right. Well, in this case, Caitlin, both of these candidates focused on two big issues of concern for Angelenos: rising crime rates and the growing number of homeless people on the streets of the city. Both of them proposing ways to do this, one slightly more aggressive than the other. In the case of Karen Bass, she's a congresswoman, member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, former Speaker of the California Assembly, who in 2020 was on the short list for serving as President Biden's running mate, you may recall, after he made the pledge to pick a woman and a black woman for the job. And in the years since, she's seen her profile rise here in the state and in Washington, but said the problems facing her hometown compelled her to think a bit about running for mayor. And we talked about that in our interview with her. You were considered by Joe Biden to be his running mate. There was talk of you either being appointed to or running for Kamala Harris's seat when she became vice president. Now you're running for mayor. First off, how did President Biden's vetting of you affect your profile here in the state? Probably helped, right?
Well, you know what, it did, but I will tell you something I honestly didn't realize to the extent that it did until people started polling in this race. I mean, I will admit people had to convince me to do this because I had to understand and believe that I could actually make a difference. But in the course of that, they did polls and they showed me that I was widely known. That I certainly knew I was widely known in my congressional district, but I didn't realize that citywide. One way to look at it is if I was a potential vice president and the president thought highly enough of me to consider me, then obviously I must have some qualifications to be mayor of the city.
An LA Times poll out over the weekend shows Bass in the lead. Remember, here in California, in these kinds of open primaries where both parties can play, somebody has to get at least 50% in the first round, or there's a runoff in November. It looks like Bass and her leading opponent, Rick Caruso, will head to that runoff in November.
Yeah, I want to ask you about Rick Caruso because he's a former Republican turned Democrat. Tell us what's behind the evolution of how he made this race so competitive.
Well, and in fact, he's a Republican turned independent or no party preference, which is a popular option here in California, and then became a Democrat just in January as he was preparing to launch his campaign, believing that that was going to help him in what is an open primary, but in what is also a very Democratic city. And he has spent about $40 million of his own dollars advertising in English, in Spanish, even in Korean in this town, on the airwaves, selling his message, arguing that he is best equipped to handle the crime wave, the increase in homelessness, the general concerns about how this city is going. And he said spending that money was worth it because he had to get his name out there, unlike professional or long-serving politicians like Karen Bass, who've been in the news for free, essentially, for several years. So we talked to him a little bit about his appeal, and he believes it has a lot to do with the fact that he's somebody who has lived his entire life and built his entire multi-billion-dollar career right here in LA.
When you live here every day, when you're born and raised, when you're not living in Washington, D.C., when you're connected to the community, I've been connected to every part of this community. You feel it in your bones of what's happening in your town. This town is dirty. It's hurting. People feel unheard. They don't have confidence in career politicians anymore. They've given them a chance. And they've given a chance to more progressive ideas. There's been a lot of experiments that have just failed. And they have failed and cost communities and families and businesses. There's a level of frustration in this city that I've been feeling for a number of years, and that's what's happening. You know, people are saying, I'm not worried about ideology, I'm worried about being safe. I'm worried about my kids being able to walk to the park. And I'm not an ideologue. I want to do what's right. I want to wake up every day and say I'm going to do what's right for the city, not what's right for my political career.
So he is the moderate in this race for sure, and he's nipping at the heels of Karen Bass, who says, well, good for him, but if he's spent $40 million and is still trailing me, who spent just a little over $3 million, then maybe it's not worth the money. Caitlin.
That's so fascinating and really interesting to see some of these themes within the Democratic Party take place in LA, but also translate across in congressional races this year. I want to ask about some of these House races. I mean, obviously, California is a blue state, but when you look at these House races, Republicans feel like they've got a good shot at picking up a few seats on their way to, they hope, claiming the majority after this year's election. Can you take us through some of these battlegrounds? Which of these states should we be, which of these districts should we be looking at in California?
Right. It's not so much out here in California that there are seats that they can add. It's that they've got to hold the ones that they currently have and not lose them to Democrats and give them an opportunity to pick some up. There are a few races to watch. Remember, 70, by our count, 78 congressional districts are holding primaries across the country tonight. Fewer than 20 of them are of the kind that could actually contribute to switching the balance of power, determining the balance of power in the House. And there are a handful here in California. Let's go through them real quick. The first one is the new 22nd Congressional District, represented by Congressman David Valadao, Republican, the first Republican who voted to impeach President Trump, who's facing a primary so far this year. He has conservative challengers. For national Republicans, the hope and expectation is that he stays up on top. If that doesn't happen and the more conservative option prevails, there's a possibility there that a Democrat could win that seat because of the makeup of it has changed. The second one to watch here, California's 40th Congressional District in Orange County. Congresswoman Young Kim, she's a freshman, one of the only women and minority members of the Republican caucus. She too has conservative challengers, had to spend a lot more money than anticipated trying to fend off a Republican challenger. That's a race that is leaning Republican, but if the conservative gets ahead of her and the Democrat gets in the race as well, there's a one Democrats might be able to pick off. And the other one they have their eye on, right here in the LA area, the 27th Congressional District, currently represented by Mike Garcia, a Republican. He's been challenged by Democrat Chrissy Smith in the last two contests they've held to see who represents this seat. There's another Democrat in the mix there. If Democrats place one or two in this race, there's a hope they can get it, because the lines in that district were redrawn in such a way that it went from a net Republican seat to a seat favoring the Democrats in terms of who voted for president in 2020. So a few examples there of the kind of seats that could flip the balance of power in the House. Again, Republicans need to maintain what they have. Democrats are hoping maybe in 1, 2, or 3 of those, depending on the wave, they might be able to pick them up and keep those Republican gains down overall nationwide.
Yeah, and before we let you go, another reason that you're in California is not just for this primary, but the Summit of Americas is taking place there that opened in LA this week. Mexico pulled out over protest over Venezuela and Cuba not being invited. Now, the White House said that dictators don't get invitations, but what are the expectations for this meeting?
We should point out they didn't entirely pull out, but their president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, is one of the heads of state who is not attending and sending foreign ministers or other ministers instead. 30 countries total, 8 of them not sending their top leader. Mexico is among them. The 3 Northern Triangle countries as well, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. So the 4 closest southern neighbors to the United States are not sending their presidents, in part because they don't want to become the ire of the Biden administration and the focus when it comes to immigration. In the case of Obrador, López Obrador, it has more to do with Cuba, less to do with the United States. Cuba, as you said, Nicaragua, Venezuela, 3 dictatorships, not democracies, not invited to attend because of that. Mexico, closely aligned with Cuba, basically has to stand up for its island brother nation against the United States in this case. But his foreign minister's coming. He's getting a meeting with the president next month in Washington. And this summit is designed to talk about a handful of things: immigration, health care, and access to COVID vaccinations across a hemisphere and a continent that still needs a lot of them, especially in the poorest of countries. A new economic framework and possible trade agreements later on. Talk about food security, one of the issues that contributes to so much illegal immigration. And then broader conversations about climate change, which is another issue that drives people to head for the American border because they can't grow crops anymore in their home countries. Lots of sort of ephemeral issues to talk about, nothing really solid expected to come of this. And of course, it's happening here in Los Angeles, while so much of Washington will be focused on other matters, including the ongoing gun talks and the January 6th committee hearings that begin Thursday night. Either way, the Biden administration eager to hold this summit and demonstrate that it's on top of things in this hemisphere, as well as the other one. Caitlin.
All right, no shortage of news in Los Angeles. Ed O'Keefe, our White House and political correspondent, earning both of those titles on the ground there in Los Angeles with White House visit and these key primaries. Appreciate your time as always, Ed.
Take care.
In addition to California, 6 other states are holding primaries. What are the top issues driving voters to the polls, and what it could tell us about the midterms in a few months? You're streaming Red and Blue.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell them I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history. The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
Along with California, it's also primary day for 6 other states across the country. New Jersey, Mississippi, Iowa, Montana, South Dakota, and New Mexico are holding local elections. A total of 78 congressional races are happening today, and many of those seats could impact the balance of power in the House after this year's midterms. CBS News political reporter Adam Brewster joins me now. Hey, Adam, thanks so much for being here. So we know you've been following all of these races. What exactly should we be watching for in these congressional primaries today?
Right. Well, within the House of Representatives, Caitlin, we know this. There are districts that are safe. We kind of know whether Democrats or Republicans are going to win them. And then you have a subset of races that will be competitive. There are roughly 20 races that are holding primaries today that are expected to have competitive seats in November, according to the Cook Political Report. So a lot of races that we'll be talking about in November, and those spread the map. Many of them are in California. You also have some, a few in New Jersey and Iowa, a couple, in Montana and down in New Mexico. But, some of the races within there that are worth watching, certainly you have in Montana, former Trump administration official Ryan Zinke trying to win his Republican primary tonight. And then in California, one of the races to keep an eye on is David Valadao. He's one of the Republicans who voted to impeach former President Trump. This is the first test of a Republican who did that. California has a sort of unique primary system. The top 2 vote getters advance in that race, so there will likely be a Democrat emerging among those top 2. And then we've seen some Democratic groups try to elevate the fact that Valadao voted for impeachment in hopes that may turn some conservatives against him to vote for some of the other Republicans who are running in that race. So that will be one to keep a close eye on out in California tonight.
Interesting races in California, to be sure. I also want to ask you, though, about Iowa, a place that you've spent a lot of time reporting. And there you have one-term Congresswoman Abby Finkenauer, who people may remember. She's really hoping to challenge Chuck Grassley, who, of course, is Iowa's 88-year-old Republican senator from Iowa. Given what you know about the state and all the reporting that you've done there, do Democrats have a realistic chance of flipping that seat?
Well, it was funny talking to Democrats in Iowa about this time 3 years ago when I went there. And they were insistent, Iowa's a purple state, Iowa's a purple state, Iowa's a purple state. And when 2020 came around, that argument certainly lost a little bit of its weight. We have seen Iowa, which was a battleground state for many years, drift to the right during the Trump years and since former President Trump left office. And so it will be a tough uphill battle for whichever Democrat emerges in that race. Now, Abby Finkenauer, former Congresswoman, she was one of the youngest people ever elected to Congress, has tried to make this sort of generational argument against Chuck Grassley, saying, hey, it's time for a change. But she's facing a tough primary against retired Admiral Michael Franken, someone who ran for the U.S. Senate as a Democrat in 2020. He did not win the nomination. there were certainly more than one Iowa Republican or Democrat, in 2020 who had said, man, we wish we would have known about this guy earlier because he would have been a great candidate in the 2020 cycle. We'll see who wins that battle between them tonight. Chuck Grassley, we should mention, does have a primary challenge against a state senator in Iowa. It is expected that Grassley will be able to survive that and go on as he tries to seek an 8th term in the United States Senate. There's been a lot of absentee voting from Republicans. It'll be interesting to see, more so certainly than 2018. It'll be interesting to see the impact that has on races on the Republican side up and down the ballot.
And what about New Mexico? I mean, New Mexico's governorship is seen by some Republicans as potentially an opportunity to flip. How's that race shaping up so far?
Right. So as we look to November, right, we will focus a lot on the battleground states, the most competitive races. And for Democratic seats currently held by Democrats that Republicans are hoping to flip, right, they will be most closely looking at Pennsylvania, at Michigan, at Wisconsin, but sort of in the next bucket of competitive races where if things are going well for Republicans, as they seem to be at this point in the cycle, they're going to be looking at New Mexico as a seat where they're hoping to flip. Democratic Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham has faced some scandals. Now, she and her allies have said, look, she has raised teacher pay, she's cut taxes, she repealed the state's criminalization on abortion. She has a lot of significant accomplishments to run on. There are several Republicans running for the chance to take her on in November. Mark Ronchetti, a former television meteorologist, has sort of been the leading fundraiser going into that. He was the Republican nominee for the United States Senate in New Mexico in 2020. He lost that race by 6 points. If he emerges tonight, he is someone who Republicans feel good about as able to give Lujan Grisham a run for her money in November, certainly depending on how the climate is when Election Day rolls around.
Yeah, big question about what that climate will look like for people like her. So, Adam, midterm elections are 5 months away from tomorrow. How are the parties fundraising, these fundraising groups and kind of outside groups and just party groups feeling about their prospects at this point? How would you say?
Certainly, Republicans are feeling good about their prospects right now. You are going to continue to see them point at the things that they think will help them. The economy, the border, crime, things of that nature. And when you are not the party in power, all you have to do is pose the question, are you better off today than you were at this point 2 or 4 years ago? And in this case, that is something you're going to hear Republicans talk about. They are going to only focus on the issues that they think help them, that they think voters are upset with. Certainly the economy will be one of those main issues. And then among Democrats, they know that time is running out, and they know that a party in power often faces headwinds during a midterm election, particularly that first midterm when a party is in power in the White House. But there are some outside groups who are saying, you've seen this talk between do Democrats need to focus on economic issues? Should they be talking about, some of the more extreme elements of the Republican Party and pointing to the January 6 hearings? Those are going to kick off this week. And we heard today from one of the major Democratic groups, Priorities USA, who said their research shows it's a false choice for Democrats. They need to be talking about the economy to certainly help with their persuadable voters. But they're seeing issues of Democrats not feeling motivated, not feeling like enough is at stake. And they think that there should also be talk about things like January 6th, heading down the campaign trail to make sure people understand what is at stake in this election from their perspective.
Motivating voters is a key issue for all of these campaigns in turning out their bases of support in a midterm. If it's a primary day, you can bet Adam Brewster is on it. So, Adam, thank you so much for your reporting and your time.
Thanks, Caitlin.
A British filmmaker who documented meetings between leaders of right-wing paramilitary groups ahead of the January 6th insurrection is set to testify publicly about the matter. Nick Quested and his documentary crew followed Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio, capturing a meeting between him and Oath Keepers leader Stuart Rhodes. Both men have been charged with seditious conspiracy for their roles in the January 6th attack. Footage shot by Quested and his crew leading up to and during the Capitol riot will be presented as part of Thursday's public testimony. The pressure is on in Congress and in the states to pass new red flag laws. But how exactly might they go into effect, and how effective are they? We'll talk to a former police commissioner who was responsible for implementing these laws. Plus, how the war in Ukraine is impacting the food supply worldwide, and why President Zelensky says this situation is about to get exponentially worse very soon. You're streaming CBS News.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history. The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
Welcome back to Red and Blue. Here's a look at some of our top stories. Congress is negotiating potential gun legislation in the wake of several deadly mass shootings. Texas Senator John Cornyn, one of the lead negotiators for Republicans, says he's optimistic that at least 10 Republicans will vote with the Democrats. Plus, U.S. gas prices are continuing to climb, reaching another record high today. Analysts predict fuel costs will continue the trend throughout the summer months due to reduced refining capacity. And Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says that she expects U.S. inflation will remain high. She also admitted making a mistake when she earlier said that it would only be temporary. A series of deadly shootings has renewed talks of red flag laws, which allow a judge to order weapons to be taken away from someone who poses a risk to themselves or to others. In Suffolk County, New York, more than 100 red flag cases have been filed since the law took effect in August of 2019. That's according to the New York Times. So for more, let's bring in Geraldine Hart. She's the former police commissioner of Suffolk County, New York, just outside New York City, and she helped direct the law's rollout. Geraldine, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your time. These red flag laws, passing them is one thing, but implementing them, as you well know, is entirely something else. What are some of the challenges that you faced in trying to do so?
No, thank you, and thank you for having me. So, yeah, it's exactly what you said. The law was passed in August of 2019, and we really saw it as a really valuable tool for us in the police department. So we wanted to make sure that we were implementing it effectively, certainly, but also responsibly. So we took a number of steps to do so. Our first step, and probably the most important, was the outreach effort. So we really wanted to connect with the community. We wanted to let them know about the law and what it was and what it wasn't. So certainly where it was applicable and instances where it wasn't applicable. That was very powerful for us. And also with our school superintendents, that was a big piece. This is, a tool that we have. We want you to know about it. We want you to know that it's out there if you need to use it. And we certainly will partner with you to help you use it, because it's one thing to enact legislation and roll it out, but it's another to make sure that people understand it and how to use it effectively. So we did the outreach piece. That was very important. And then we did the training. The training of our officers, pulling them off the street, training them on this, because they're the ones who are seeing people in crisis, seeing people that perhaps are a threat to themselves or others. And we want them to know that this law is available and how to use it. And then really just an ongoing support system for the officers so that they can, reach out if they have a question to an attorney. So we had our legal bureau on a 24/7 rotation to answer any questions that the officer might have, that he is in a situation that is really very concerning to him or her, and they really need a solution. And so we really thought that the red flag law was something that can make a difference in people's lives and make our county safer.
And what has been the impact? I mean, how effective of a tool did you find that such laws trying to keep firearms out of potentially dangerous people's hands turned out to be where you are?
Yeah, I think it was effective. I mean, I could tell you that, we've had family members talk to us about it, that they didn't know that the young person, their student or teenager was, having suicidal ideations or was speaking, at length about guns that were in the house and his intention on using them. So things like that were really powerful. And to have that family in front of a judge and the judge to say to them, listen, this is not okay. This is not some, harmless pastime. This is very serious and consequential. And I think families were able to hit pause and really get perhaps the help that young person needed. And that was really impactful for us.
In Congress, they are talking about a proposal that would provide some grants to states to try to incentivize them to implement red flag laws. Do you think that would be an effective way to kind of legislate on this?
I think it would, and I think also it's also kind of sends the message that there needs to be some, rollout with it. It needs to be outreach and support and training with it in a systematic way, and in a way that is not just in the immediate, aftermath of the legislation, but a prolonged effort to make sure that people understand what it is. I know the governor just expanded those that can file a petition, a red flag law petition, to healthcare workers. So, again, to partner with them and train them and let them know that the police department is there to help them.
Yeah, outreach and information is key. Some conservatives are arguing that states with the highest rates of murder by guns, the places where you're having the highest rates of murders by guns are happening in cities with the most restrictive gun laws. This is kind of the argument that they're making when asked to respond in some way to these recent shootings. But how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I know that there's a lot of discussion going on around this topic, both on the local, state, and federal level, and these are important conversations that we need to have. And there are, a plethora of different tools that are being discussed and being, debated. And certainly, for us in Suffolk County, we definitely felt that the red flag law was a very valuable tool and something that we really effectively used, and I hope that will continue to be used in that way.
Yeah, certainly has some support from both sides of the aisle, and we've seen it passed in red states as well. And in your experience, what are some of the things that you've seen that have actually had a demonstrable effect on reducing crime? Because we're hearing this in city after city after city that this is an issue. What are some of the things that you have done to help curb crime?
So for us in Suffolk, we did a number of different things. Many of them were proactive in nature, and certainly different ways of looking at an issue. So I'll give you an example of human trafficking, which was certainly an issue in Suffolk County. And we really kind of changed the paradigm and looked at the victims not just as criminals, really, but as the victims that they were, which led us to get their cooperation and lead us up the chain to bigger traffickers. So. It's also in the area of opioids, not just, criminalizing, obviously, there are crimes that go along with it, but can we talk about prevention and treatment along with those? So depending on the actual issue, certainly proactive when you can be, and precision policing, of course, in areas that are experiencing high intense crime rates. That's certainly something that was very effective for us in Suffolk County. We started the gun task force, and that was very effective for us to really just focus in on those specific crime problems that we were having, persistent crime problems.
A potential roadmap for other places as well. Geraldine Hart, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great to be with you.
The U.S. is seizing a Russian-owned super yacht in Fiji after winning a legal battle there. Authorities took command of the $325 million yacht, sailing it away from the South Pacific country. Fiji's Supreme Court ruled in favor of the U.S., letting officials take control of the vessel. It's an important win for the United States as it seizes the assets of Russian oligarchs around the world in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The impact of the war on Ukraine is being felt across the globe as Russian blockades wreak havoc on food supply chains. CBS News foreign correspondent Chris Livesay has more on what the international leaders are saying about this food shortage predicament.
Well, the war in Ukraine has already gone global when you consider the impact on food. More than 20 million tons of grain remain blocked here on the Black Sea thanks to a Russian blockade. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says that mountain will likely triple by this fall. And most of that food is destined for the developing world. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is accusing Russia of blackmail, essentially holding this food hostage in retaliation for the West's support of Ukraine. But there are signs that support could be in jeopardy. French President Emmanuel Macron has urged finding a, quote, off-ramp to avoid humiliating Vladimir Putin and possibly escalating this war. But Ukraine says the only way to stop Russia is a resounding defeat on the battlefield. Chris Livesay, CBS News, Odessa, Ukraine.
Senators Mitt Romney and Jon Ossoff are calling for a State Department investigation into the death of Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. In a letter to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the lawmaker said her death infringes upon U.S. freedom of press. The Al Jazeera reporter and U.S. citizen was killed while working in a conflict zone in the West Bank last month. Witnesses say she was struck by Israeli fire, but Israeli officials say that the source of the fatal shot was not yet determined. The State Department has not said whether the Biden administration will open an investigation into her killing. The Department of Homeland Security is issuing a warning related to mass school shootings in Uvalde, Texas. Why the agency says recent mass killings could make Americans everywhere less safe, and how the agency is trying to determine which threats are credible. You're streaming CBS News.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell him I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
We will witness yet another moment in history. The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel.
Here we are in our virtual view. Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
The Department of Homeland Security is warning that online extremist forums are encouraging copycat attacks after the mass shooting at Robb Elementary in Uvalde, Texas. The DHS says these extremist platforms are taking advantage of the shooting to spread disinformation and incite more users, especially those who are young and male. So for more, let's bring in CBS News Homeland Security and Justice reporter Nicole Skanga. Hey, Nicole, thanks so much for being here. I know you've been all over this story. So what more can you tell us about this bulletin?
Thanks for having me, Caitlin. Well, according to today's bulletin, some of these online platforms have also seized on the Uvalde shooting in hopes of spreading this false claim that it was a government-staged event meant to advance gun control measures. Today's bulletin points out that both the suspect in the Buffalo shooting and the shooter behind the 2019 El Paso massacre said they were inspired by the attacker of 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand earlier that year. You might remember that from 2019. And so this possibility of ideological beliefs prompting copycat attacks in the wake of Buffalo, in the wake of Uvalde, is the main concern here. That is what keeps these DHS officials up at night.
And what does more dynamic mean? And what else should we expect?
Yeah, dynamic is this term used by Homeland Security officials that, points to a more nuanced threat environment. There are overlaps. It's not a straight line. I'll give you one example. This month, the Supreme Court is set to issue its final decision on whether or not to overturn Roe versus Wade. Of course, we've already seen that draft majority opinion, but law enforcement remains concerned and pointed out in this bulletin, grievances relating to restricting abortion access could fuel a much broader response here, not just from violent extremists who are pro-choice, but, for example, individuals that are motivated by racial or ethnic beliefs. They're seeing more overlap between those encouraging racist violence and anti-abortion policies, both which share this sort of long history of extremist anxiety about, fertility and great replacement conspiracy theories in the United States and beyond. So that is why this dynamic threat environment is so challenging. There are so many overlaps, and officials are really piecing through online content to try to determine what is specific, what is credible.
That's really startling to see all those connections. Do we know about who is actually carrying out these attacks and any sense of where they're meeting online?
Yeah, Caitlin, you alluded to this earlier. DHS officials telling us that they understand that younger individuals sometimes fail to seek out credible information online. That disinformation has driven aggrieved actors to violence, in some cases teenagers. In fact, since 2018, 6 of the 9 deadliest mass shootings in the United States have been carried out by gunmen 21 years of age or younger. One challenge here is really, again, determining what are the specific and credible calls to violence among these young people online, some on encrypted platforms, which is harder for law enforcement, to gain access to. And of course, with First Amendment free speech concerns, there is this question of at what point does, some of this content turn violent? At what point should police get involved?
Yeah, really interesting, but fascinating that they're able to create some kind of profile of who's doing this. And you kind of touched on this a little bit, but what are some of these beliefs that are being spread on these social media sites? What are they really talking about here?
Yeah, analysts and researchers from DHS have been scanning these online platforms, particularly those known to house some of these conspiracy theories. And, they found a pattern in the wake of Uvalde, in the wake of Buffalo, this baseless great replacement or white genocide conspiracy theory I mentioned before. It falsely alleges that minorities, multiculturalists, and a ruling elite are deliberately threatening the existence of the white race. Now, officials are also tracking other threats related to the midterm elections in November. Of course, we've got more primaries, coming up, and that applies to both U.S.-based actors that could reprise some of their 2020 election grievances, but it also covers foreign actors trying to sow discord and influence here, as we've seen before, from countries like Russia and Iran. And finally, amid the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, government analysts also finding that Russia and other actors have amplified conspiracy theories, alleging that the United States, falsely, of course, is responsible for the war ongoing in Ukraine right now.
Certainly a persistent threat that we've seen in these elections. It's fascinating that they're able to kind of pinpoint and find all of this and create awareness, but what can these government agencies actually do to prevent such attacks? Is there anything they can really do?
Yeah, we've seen a fair amount of funding, dollars and resources that have been, thrown in the direction of threat mitigation in recent years. For example, in 2022, DHS provided $250 million in funding to support nonprofits at high risk of terrorist attacks. So, for example, places of worship, hardening that physical security. And Secretary Mayorkas, Secretary of DHS, has proposed raising those allocations to $360 million total in fiscal year 2023. Now, DHS also awarding 37 grants amounting to $20 million as part of what it's called its Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Program in 2021, designed to help local communities combat extremist threats. The Biden administration has also issued more than 100 intelligence products related to domestic violent extremism, including 6 of these types of terrorist bulletins. The latest one expires November 30th. But we should also note, Caitlin, what both federal and state law enforcement is trying to do here is also to try to reach out and empower the whole community, the local community, be it teachers, school administrators, counselors, faith leaders, to be engaged, because it's those individuals that will be the first ones to potentially identify an individual that may be at risk of going down a path of violence and notifying law enforcement or notifying other social services. So that is the strategy here by federal and state law enforcement, obviously throwing some funding at this problem, but also trying to empower local leaders and members of the community to really speak out when they see something.
Fascinating. There's so many layers to this, but such an important thread here as we're following this story. Nicole Skanga, thank you so much, as always, for your reporting.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break, which means you have a couple of minutes to download the free CBS News app on all your devices. You can catch live local coverage from across the country from all of our CBS stations. And while you're at it, check out Paramount Plus. We've got a mountain of content there for you to stream as well, including your favorite shows, movies, and sports.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting from CBS News. What's your message to consumers? They need help now. Tell them I feel it.
The CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell from Washington, D.C. on CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
We will witness yet another moment in history. The threat of severe weather and dangerous tornadoes is expected to last.
Let's get the forecast from our partners at the Weather Channel. Here we are in our virtual view.
Now 6 feet of water, imagine that. Cars that can act like battering rams.
These hyper-realistic simulations show you what the weather will look and feel like before it happens.
This is our virtual view, what it actually looks like.
Those are some of the best graphics I've seen.
Spare no expense, Gail.
We experience the weather in a whole new way.
President Biden signed 9 bipartisan bills today to improve care for veterans. One of the bills expands access to breast cancer screenings and improves breast imaging services. At the signing, President Biden promised to strengthen the oversight on veterans' care. Natalie Brand has more from Washington.
Morning. CBS News spoke with Marine veteran Dr. Kate Hendricks Thomas less than 6 months before she lost her battle with stage 4 breast cancer, leaving behind her young son Matthew and her husband Shane.
The radiologist said it looked like I'd been dipped in something.
Hendricks Thomas learned of her diagnosis at age 38, more than a decade after returning home from Iraq, where she was exposed to toxic burn pits on base. Fellow Marine veteran Mindy Byer has been closely tracking legislation named in her friend's honor, requiring the Department of Veterans Affairs to provide mammograms for those who served near burn pits or had other toxic exposures, regardless of symptoms, age, or family history.
We hope that the message is getting out to veterans. If you have been serving, even if you weren't around burn pits, there's a possibility you were around some sort of toxic exposure. Please go earlier. Please check yourself out.
The legislation is one of 9 bills for veterans the president signed into law Tuesday.
Because veterans are the backbone, the spine of who we are as a country. We owe them. We owe them big.
This signing ceremony comes with pressure on Capitol Hill to still pass legislation to help an estimated 3.5 million veterans exposed to toxins in more recent conflicts. It took Hendricks Thomas 3 years to get her claim approved after it was initially denied.
Kate was very proud to serve her country, and I think that her message would always be fight for your country, but then fight for each other when you get back.
It's a message advocates hope senators hear when they take a final vote on burn pit legislation expected later this week. Natalie Brand, CBS News, Washington.
That does it for today. You can stream Red and Blue Monday through Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. And a reminder, if you want to watch previous episodes of the program, you can see them anytime on our CBS News website. Just head to cbsnews.com/redandblue.
CBS News Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS.
I'm Norah O'Donnell in our nation's capital. We're here at the White House with the President of the United States.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You've never done an interview like this before.
That's correct.
Tonight, a congressional investigation sparked by reporting